to another interesting class. This week's topic is on Ife and Bini art culture. We are going to look at the different techniques of producing these artworks. We are going to focus on the lost wax bronze casting, the carving of elephant tugs and wood carvings, and we are going to concentrate more on the different marks that are produced in Benin. And again, we are going to concentrate more on the reasons why the Bini art and the Ife art culture is referred to as art for life, and how the environment were able to influence these art pieces, and how the urbans were able to instruct the craftsmen on what and how to produce these art pieces. And again, we are going to look at how the immediate environment influences the production of these art pieces. Let's join me as we meet in this. Stay tuned as we pay attention to detailed information.
Art in Africa, like music and like traditional religion, is an essential tool to help us understand the history of the continent. From rock paintings to wood sculptures, from terracotta pots to bronze masks, all give us a unique insight into the past.
These works were not made as art for art's sake as they are in the West. They're really art made for life's sake. They played a very important role in the lives of the people who made them. They were not meant for museums. They were handled, they were fondled, they were part of the entire society.
Artwork records many of the great events in Africa: foreign invasions, royal ceremonies, religious worship. But art also gives us a window into the small domestic details of day-to-day life.
The Story of Africa, History from an African Perspective. Part 12, The Art of Ife and Bini, presented by Hugh Kwashi.
Africa, 900 years ago. A great power, a cultured people. In the kingdom of Ife, now in Nigeria, a rich tradition of sculpture flourished, unlike anything in Africa or Europe at the time. These are works of technical sophistication, magnificent craftsmanship, and astonishing natural beauty. Come to the British Museum and connect with the humanity, the mystery, and the art of Ife.
Ile-Ife in southwest Nigeria is the sacred city of the Yoruba. According to traditional belief, it was founded by Oduduwa, the son of Olorun, god of the sky, and became a powerful cultural and spiritual center. The art of Ife dates from around the 12th to the 15th century, though the earliest pieces may be much older. It is made up of work in terracotta, bronze, and stone. Some of the sculptures are heads or busts of human figures, others of animals.
The naturalistic pieces of Ife are truly the most naturalistic African art pieces you can find. They cannot be ignored.
Dr. Ohioma Pogoson, lecturer in art history in the African Institute at the University of Ibadan.
Well, naturalistic, that is a true representation of human and animal forms, and it was comparable to that of classical Greek and Renaissance Rome, for example. And so the earliest Westerners to interact with Ife art originally thought that they were not works of art of black people.
The way these objects are now being showcased is going to rekindle our belief, that if an object has been existing or we find an object 11th century, 12th century. How did they get there? These are the questions we should now be asking. Who were the people there? And with this exhibition, it's going to bring out more curiosity. People want to find out what is actually happening.
This astonishing sculpture in gleaming copper represents one of the rulers, or Oni, of the kingdom of Ife in western Nigeria 7 or 8 centuries ago. And yet when these superb sculptures first came to the attention of Europeans, only as recently as 1910, the experts at once pronounced that Africans could never have conceived or made them, and that some wandering European must have been the artist. Now the world knows better. The truth is that these are portraits of African kings made by African artists for use in royal ceremonial.
What's important about these ones is they're full standing figures. They show the Oni, or the king of Ife, at the moment of coronation. So he's wearing a crown, he's holding a horn with medicine in his hand, and he has a staff in the other hand, and he has this regalia of red parrot feathers on his chest.
It's beautiful. Why are these images so important?
They're so important because they're equivalent to the medieval sculptures in cathedrals today. So if you look for the image of Henry VII or of Richard II, these are the same date, and yet they have much more detail, they have much more humanity, and they have much more individuality than the sculptures being done in Gothic and early modern Britain.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The head of Ife is 3/4 life-size and named after the town of Ile-Ife in Nigeria, where it was dug up nearly 70 years ago. It's hollow and made of leaded brass about 1 centimeter thick. The head wears a crown that was originally painted red. Over the centuries, the once shining brass face has taken on a natural green patina. The head of Ife is thought to be as much as 800 years old.
This object over here was the first object from Ife to enter a museum collection. It came to the British Museum. It's one of 2 objects from the British Museum in the exhibition, and it came here in 1896. And it is a quartz or quartzite stool or throne, and it shows an enormous elephant trunk, and on it would have sat the Oni, or the king of Ife, with his legs astride the elephant trunk and his feet on a stool, because of course if he was king he mustn't touch the ground.
Early excavations of Ife sculptures were carried out by the German ethnologist Leo Frobenius. On finding brass and terracotta heads in the Olokon Grove in Ife in 1910, he was astounded by the quality of the artwork, describing it as
eloquent, of a symmetry, a vitality, a delicacy of form directly reminiscent of ancient Greece.
But, he continued,
it is proof that once upon a time a race far superior to the Negro had settled here.
Like many other Europeans at that time, Frobenius simply couldn't accept that such art could be of African origin. Indeed, he found it more probable that the sculptures had come from the mythical lost Greek colony of Atlantis. This, despite the fact that the sculptures clearly depicted black African features. Although it was the naturalistic faces that had impressed many Westerners, the Ife craftsmen had also produced other heads that were conical and much more abstract. Professor Roland Abiodun.
It meant that there were two types of head: the outer naturalistic head and the inner spiritual head. The inner spiritual head is the one that is more important and more powerful than the outer spiritual head, which is why the Yoruba always pray that may your inner head not spoil your outer head.
According to the Yoruba myth, one of the sons of the deity Oduduwa left Ife to found his own kingdom in Benin.
Ife antiquities first really came to light in 1910. What happened was that a German adventurer and anthropologist called Leo Frobenius had heard about the mythic kingdom of Ife, and he decided in 1908 to go there. He went there in 1910. He took a man called Martius with him. They spent 3 weeks there. They got a team of Africans. They burrowed into the sacred grove underneath the ground. They found terracottas. For the first time you have here a cast of a terracotta head found in 1910, the original in Berlin, back together with the original headdress, which is still in Nigeria.
For a few weeks in 1910, Frobenius carried out excavations and unearthed many terracotta and stone heads. But he was also shown a brass head, which he was told was Olokun, the Yoruba god of the sea. He photographed it for his book, The Voice of Africa. It bears a striking resemblance to the head of Ife in the British Museum.
He thought it was of Greek or ancient European origin. He identified it with Poseidon, with the god of the sea. He identified the kingdom of Ife with the lost kingdom of Atlantis. And he wrote all of this up, and indeed it was published in the Illustrated London News over there in 1910. What happened in order to disprove all of this was over there where those people are two small brasses excavated in 1939 by Thurston Shaw, Igbo Ukwe brasses. One is of an elephant head, and those are about 1,000 years old. And they proved that this was an autonomous African tradition.
Finds expression in such diverse activities as weaving, basketry, beadwork and jewelry. But it is in sculpture that the continent is often viewed as having excelled. And it is from Nigeria that
The sight of the brass Olokun head threw Leo Frobenius into a state of utter confusion. He simply couldn't believe that the people of Ife had ever been capable of making such a sophisticated object.
Closer to me is the cast of the head which Leo Frobenius was shown in 1910, which is called the Olokun head. And the second is the original head, which is in the British Museum. As you can see, both heads are done according to the same aesthetic traditions. The treatment of the face, the nose, the lips are made in the same way. The treatment of the ethnic marks are the same also on the face. They indicate the same tradition of producing brass heads.
In January 1938, a man started digging the foundations for a new house in this compound, not far from the royal palace of the king, or Oni of Ife. As the work progressed on this site, a total of 18 sculptures were unearthed. Many were lying just a few feet below the surface, and one of them was the head now in the British Museum.
Well, you can really say that the Ife metal heads were discovered twice. They were discovered for the first time by Frobenius in 1910. But that was somehow forgotten, and then they were rediscovered again in the late 1930s.
This sensational and unexpected new find was reported with great enthusiasm by an American anthropologist, William Bascom, for the Illustrated London News. Such was the high quality of the work that he likened the unknown people who made them to the great Italian Renaissance sculptor, Donatello. He wrote, "Little that Italy, Greece, or Egypt ever produced could be finer, and the appeal of their beauty is immediate and universal." Most of the heads unearthed in 1938 remained with the Oni of Ife. These are casts of some of them held in the British Museum collection. The sight of such a large group of refined naturalistic work had a profound effect on Europeans, but the idea still persisted that they couldn't be the work of Africans. In his article, William Bascom wrote, "How in a comparatively obscure corner of this vast and backward continent could an art and a technique have flowered that take their stand beside the best ever evolved by the elaborate civilizations of Europe and Asia?"
Look at the collection here, at the artifacts. They are mostly heads. What is the fascination with the heads?
That's a good question. In the Yoruba kingdom, we believe the head is where authority comes from. So let me put it that way, the leader is the center of power. And we believe authority is in the head and it's in the mouth.
Ife was preoccupied with religion, with ritual. And most of this represented the Ife cosmology of the head as the center of power. And the head defined you. You didn't define, the body did not define the head. The head is an entity unto itself. The fact that we're seeing so many heads here is something to do with that religious belief within the Ife setting of the time. Before its decline, Ife was a cosmopolitan setting, and you will see so many heads and faces showing different groups who existed in Ife.
In the Yoruba tradition and legendary stories, Ife came to be as the divine establishment of God, who sent one of his messengers, Video.Guru, to establish the land over water. He came with a chicken and with a bowl of sand. The sand was spread on water, and a chicken was kept on the little sand. And as the chicken scatters the sand, land emerged from the water, and that is what is called Ile Ife.
There's a particular story associated with this terracotta head. It's said to represent Lajua, a chief attendant to the Oni Awurukulukin. When his master died, Lajua decided to conceal the king's death by adopting his regalia and his identity himself. Lajua was later put to death for his treachery, but he has since become a celebrated figure. Professor John Picton.
The neck of the figure has a number of lines around it which probably represent those little rings of fat that a well-tended body tends to have in West Africa as a result of a decent diet. And they are, in the recent past, as we know, a sign of beauty in both men and women.
For some time, all the good things which were discovered in Africa was believed not to have been made by Africans. Fortunately, we have moved far away from that. If we consider the time when this was made in Europe, it is still Middle Age, and the aesthetics of these heads are even far beyond many things which were produced in Europe at that time.
It wasn't just that Europeans couldn't believe that Africans had the artistic sensibility to create such an object as the head of Ife. They couldn't believe either that Africans had the technological know-how to cast it. The head of Ife was made using the lost wax process, now known to have been practiced in West Africa for centuries before the first Europeans set foot there.
The artist would have started with a clay core, probably with some animal dung, perhaps some cereal husk in there as well. Once the clay core was modelled into a roughly human head shape, sheets of beeswax would have been modelled onto that of a known thickness. And a lot of the Ife heads are cast incredibly finely. So the thinness of the wax, which was probably also a relatively valuable material, would have been important. And this would have been modelled to give all the detail that the final metal casting should have. Having done that, he would enclose the whole wax and structure with this same clay dung sand mixture very carefully pushed into all the detail that was in the head. And it's how well he pushes the mixture into the wax, how well the bronze will actually cast.
The clay surround with the head inside would then have been heated and the wax melted out. In the traditional lost wax process, molten metal is then poured into the space that's been left. But the head of Ife has a secret. It was probably cast using a variation of this technique.
The open pouring of metal tends to be a much later development in Africa. The early West African tradition seems to all have been the enclosed crucible. So what the Ife artist would have done is he would have attached these casting channels, rods of wax, and they would have come to a cup at the top. But in West Africa, they actually put the chips of metal into this space here. They then put an old shard of pottery over the top to protect it and enclosed the whole mold like that, so that the metal was already enclosed in the mold. The mold could then be put in a fire, the wax melted out of it, and with a little drain hole that's there, drains all the wax out, that gets plugged, and then the fire's built up in temperature until all these little chips of metal here melt and they flow down into the space where the wax was and fill it up, and hey presto, you've got your bronze.
The general quality of the casting is quite excellent. The metal clearly flowed through all the parts of the mould, including the intricacies of the details on the headdress or crown, and more especially where you look at this, it really is just a one-piece, one-off casting with very little in the way of necessary repairs afterwards where the metal didn't flow or the mould collapsed or something like that, which honestly is a very common fault. If you have a look at your average Greek or Roman equivalent bronze head, then you'll find repairs and things all over them.
In the 1980s, the head of Ife was analysed by metal scientists at the British Museum. 2 small samples were drilled from the head, one from the neck and the other from the crown. The results of the analysis not only determined the composition of the alloy used, but also gave an indication of how the head was actually cast.
When we took samples from the head, we were hoping to be able to try and find out more about the casting conditions. This particular alloy is of copper and zinc and lead, but if the metal is molten, then of course the dense droplets of lead have time to sink through the molten brass and concentrate at the bottom. And what we found was there is about 11.8% of lead in the neck of the sample and about 10.8 in the top of the head. Now this may not seem very much, but it is significant. It does show that the head was cast upright, and secondly, it does suggest that the metal was molten in the mould for, I would guess, 2 or 3 minutes to give the time for that amount of segregation to take place, which once again is a sign of a pretty proficient casting. The guy who cast that knew what he was doing.
Analysis of the head also showed that the brass from which it was fashioned was probably imported from thousands of miles away, across the Sahara Desert.
Many years ago, the remains of a caravan was found that clearly had lost its way. It was carbon dated to the 12th century, the bones of the camels, and it was perfectly preserved in the dry conditions, and amongst it was bundles and bundles of brass rods, and these brass rods have very much the same composition as the Ife head, and so this is a probable source of the metal.
I think there's no doubt that that head in the British Museum is the image of an Oni. The headdress and everything that we know suggests that.
This is a person who is aware about his power and about what he can achieve in this world. He knows that he's a great man and very sure of his power and his influence. It's a royal attitude.
The Onis of Ife had every reason to be sure of their power and influence. For the Yoruba people, the Oni was not just a king, he was a deity. And according to Yoruba mythology, the city of Ile-Ife, where he held court, was the place where the gods descended from the sky and created the world. The Oni claimed direct descent from Oduduwa, the founding god of the Yoruba kingdom. And the supreme status of this man is shown by the fact that he is wearing a crown decorated with beads, a sign of his nobility and wealth.
The beads in the crown mean that this was a very high personality. The crown was certainly a composite structure. It is possible that the base was cotton woven cap, maybe in the style of what we see now. We have some photographs of that as well. And if you look at the top of the crown, you can see these elements which are beads. The beads were produced in Ile-Ife for a long period before the European came, and we know that they were making red tubular beads. And probably in the British Museum head, what you can find here, this painted in red, suggests the red tubular beads.
The huge significance of beads in Ife society can be seen in another brass sculpture dug up at the same time as the head of Ife. It shows a half figure, again interpreted as an Oni. He not only wears a beaded crown, but he's bedecked in intricate beaded regalia. In 1948, the sculptures unearthed 10 years earlier were reunited and put on display at the British Museum.
South from Ife and near the coast, there flourished the ancient city and empire of Benin.